Thank you for waiting. Can you hear me? Nod if you can. I see nodding. I see thumbs up. Terrific. Terrific. Welcome to the town hall. Much different town hall than we might have had 2 years ago because I'd only been elected for about a month, and now I've had an interim, and we've had a whole lot of things that happened. So we're going to talk tonight. We're going to look back at the last couple of years, and we're going to look ahead at the coming session. Just first of all, I do want to thank my staff for all the work they've put in over the past 2 years, and how tell you all how excited they are about the session that's coming up. Hello to my family, and thank you to my family that's continues to support me in this work, and all of you who maintain your interest and engagement in what we're doing here for Texas government. There are some high level things I want to talk about before we get into specific bills and that sort of thing, and then we'll move into questions at the end. At the high level, a lot of people are asking, they're concerned about the attitude in the nation, about the political atmosphere, about a siege on the national capital, and what effect it might have here in Texas at our state capitol and for this upcoming legislative session. And as we're about to inaugurate our next president, I do think it's fitting to comment and consider just for a moment what is happening in the national attitude. And it's fairly alarming, even here in Texas, on that critical point of, do we have armed, angry people? Yeah, we do, and I'm grateful that we have the Department of Public Safety that's monitoring dark web stuff, communications, activities of groups, and this stuff's really going on, and it is making a lot of legislators nervous. But I feel that we are going to come out of this on the other side. I don't think it's ultimately going to disturb what we're doing in the legislature, but it is coloring everyone's attitude as we enter. And I think it heightens the importance of taking a reasonable approach to things, of listening to each other, of finding things that we can achieve, and not just finding a reason to fight over stuff because the atmosphere is already hypercharged in that direction. Um, so I'm entering this session fully expecting to pass a lot of bills with bipartisan support, and fully expecting and hoping to have a reasonable, intense, informed dialogue on the things that matter to all of us. The other thing that, of course, is hanging over all of us, our economy, our personal lives, is COVID 19. And that is something that concerns every state legislator, every member of elected government, whether it's the city council, state government, federal government, county government. And we are looking to see ways that we can help. The county is working with the state. They're working with private sector vendors. We've had 1.3 million vaccines that so far have been reported to have been administered here in Texas. More than that actually have been administered, because one of the glitches when you have a global pandemic and a non-rehearsed response to it is that they're still working on the reporting. We've had more like 1.7 million delivered to Texas. There have been some glitches in the administration part of it. They're working through those things. We got another 843,000 vaccines delivered to Texas just this week, and we expect it to ramp up from there. It couldn't come fast enough. We all really want it to happen quickly. For questions on how this is handling, your best resource is going to be Dallas County, dallascounty.org. We will help to the extent that we can. And we're going to try as a state to make sure that we have the resources that we need to make sure that the vaccine is delivered and administered absolutely as quickly as possible. As for the legislature itself, we are not going to let COVID stop us from doing our job. There's been a lot of talk about a throttled session, about not being able to achieve what we need to achieve. But I can tell you that I and every legislator I've talked to are determined to do the work that we've been elected to do. Last session, we had over 7,000 bills. We passed a little over 1,000 of them. We may have fewer bills filed. We may have fewer hearings. But that same 1,000, 1,500 bills, whatever we get done, I think it's not going ultimately to be affected by COVID. Now, our productivity this session, our ability to respond to the things that we have to respond to, is also affected by another major thing that's on top of everyone's mind right now. In addition to the crazy hyperpartisan atmosphere, in addition to the devastation of COVID 19, we've got redistricting this session. For some reason, every 10 years, we decide that in addition to all the work that we're supposed to be doing for the state of Texas, we're going to redraw the maps, and we're going to do it so that it's all tinged with partisanship. And personally, I think that we ought to have nonpartisan redistricting commissions. I don't expect that to happen immediately. So we do have redistricting on the agenda. Is it going to push out other important work that we have to do? And the answer is I don't think it will. People have been working on this all interim. I've been put on the committee myself. It's going to take up some hours. But for better or for worse, in all likelihood, the data that is required for the legislature to be able to draw the maps that it needs to draw is not going to be available in time for us to draw them during the session. Most of that work is likely to get pushed into the summer, which means we are going to have a closer to a normal bandwidth to achieve the work that we've got to achieve. But there will be pressure, and it's all the more important that we be efficient and effective and deliberative in how we proceed this last legislative session. Which brings me to the look back, as far as from a legislative perspective. During this interim, it was fascinating and a great deal of fun for me to have an interim. It's the first time I've had an interim. And I remember right after I got elected 2 years ago, I knew I had this big 6 month period of a tremendous amount of work ahead of me. But what on earth was I going to do for that year and a half before the next session? And a month into it, I was wondering, oh my gosh, how are we going to get it all done in just a year and a half? And we have been busy. We have been hard at work, both in generating the bills that we want to file and researching them, developing them, talking with constituents, and developing strategies, identifying the things that we can do and maybe the things we can't, or how do we do some things right now to set up to be able to do things later. So it's been a constant, exciting level of work. And the result is that whereas last bill, over the course of the first few months, the bills that came to me and that we filed, around 50 bills, we've already filed before the session opened 45 what I think are very good bills. We've got another 60 bills that we already have drafted or are in progress. We may not file all of those bills. It's important to, we don't generally just file bills to make statements. Sometimes we do because statements need to be made. But we also want to figure out how can we be most effective. But the volume of work has been enormous just in developing our own agenda. But there's more than just coming up with answers. If it was just about coming up with answers, we could just, circle a petition on the internet and run some sort of algorithm or do a doodle poll or something and come up with the answers and walk into the legislative session. It's really about passing those bills. How do you get these things through the legislature? And for me, as an elected official, it's really been one of the wonderful things about having an interim is I have time to reach out to Republicans in the House, Democrats in the House, Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, talk with people on committees, staff members, working with staff members, find out where we can cooperate. Where do our interests align? I've got a bill that we'll talk about. We've got several bills that we can talk about later where it's really interesting, people who you've opposed on many, many things, and you find out you agree on this one thing. And it's going to require the effort of you and your staff and them and their staff to move these things through the legislature because you might be the only two people who know about it, or you might not. You might be the only two people who understand how important it is to everybody. And all of that happens in this interim period. It also happens, then the whole thing speeds up in real time for the next 5 or 6 months. Um, but having had the time to start developing those relationships, to start plowing those paths, clearing those paths, figuring out where the obstacles are, what the landscape looks like, enough land metaphors. But that really is what sets us up for a successful session. And given the hyper-partisan environment, it's particularly important to figure out where are the partisan obstacles and how do we talk about this? How do we move this in a way that it's not going to run into a blockade? Um, and I'm actually going to this session quite optimistic that there are many things that we can get done, notwithstanding a partisan makeup that might sometimes otherwise appear to be intransigent or resistant to progress in certain places. So I think that we've got a House and a Senate that is determined not to be as dysfunctional as what we have in DC. And I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats. It always starts out a little bit more together and happy, then it ends up in the middle. And by the end, things have a tendency to come back together again because we all know how important the work that we do is. So let's talk about some of that work. One lens to look through is committee assignments. What I will be doing is somewhat, although not exclusively affected by the committees that I get assigned to. I've been assigned to Business and Commerce, very busy committee, just a lot of stuff goes through there. Redistricting, yay. Jurisprudence, Water and Agriculture. And I have been named the vice chair of the Administration Committee. that is a signal of confidence. And I'm very pleased to actually, as a only second session senator, have a vice chairmanship of the admin committee. And that's a committee that, while it deals with local bills, it has some power in some instances. Does it mean that I won't be doing anything in healthcare? Because I was on Health and Human Services last session, and I've spent a lot of time and I've devoted a lot of my team's efforts on many different, very important healthcare initiatives. No, it doesn't mean I'm backing away from those at all. I'll just be bringing them to the committee. I won't be sitting on the committee for the other 2,000 bills, but I will remain involved in healthcare. In fact, I and my dedicated, hardworking, talented staff will be responsible for all 15 committees, for all 7,000 bills that come through the legislature. We're not going to be experts in every single bill. Part of this interim process, part of being close to other members of the legislature is that you can develop relative areas of expertise and rely on another. So you can't possibly cover everything, but you do need to be aware of everything, and you do need to be prepared to participate in every different field. I've got a small collection of what I think are really great and really important criminal justice reform bills. I'm not on the criminal justice committee, but that doesn't excuse me from the obligation of serving my district and my state in ways that people come to me and show me things that are important, or that my staff identifies, or that I identify that are important. So we're playing in the whole field, but there will be 5 places where I spend more of my time running through bills every day, evaluating them, passing them onto the floor, modifying them in committee. Um, the redistricting one, I said yay, and I was being a little bit um, uh, I was being a little bit silly there. It's a scary committee to be on because it ramps up and there's a ton of work and then there's not much work. And somebody said, "Oh my gosh, that's a terrible committee to be on because everybody will dislike everything you do." I mean, no one likes a map, but it's an important process, and I take it very, very seriously. Same with jurisprudence. These things are not the kind of things that grab all the headlines, and the details are very, very specific. But every committee in the House and every committee in the Senate has important stuff that goes through it, and I take my job very seriously. And I will, if you're on a committee, it's your job to be an important member of that committee, and that's the attitude that my staff takes in. That's the attitude that I take in. So, with working on these committees and with this big, ambitious agenda of bills I want to file, there's one other big thing that affects all of us and what we're able to do, and that is the budget. And the budget forecast has been grim, grim, grim. And if you've been listening for the last year, you've probably heard this little grinding wheel in the background. And if you'd look, there's these axes right there because people are getting ready to cut out all the fat of the Texas budget, which is really a scary thing because we don't have any. We run a very lean, efficient machine around here. And in some ways that's good, and in some ways it's not so good. But I'll tell you when it's not good is when you got to make cuts because we don't have much room. The good news is the budget forecast that came out a week ago was rather surprising, but fairly well supported. That we're not in the hole anywhere near what we thought we were going to be. We thought we might have a $20 billion budget shortage going into the next budget cycle. It looks like we might be less than $1 billion short. I mean, we've got $9 billion in the rainy day fund. We're going to be okay with this. We also have $2 billion in leftover COVID stimulus federal funding that originally we were going to have to spend by the end of last year. We did not. Fortunately, the deadline to spend that money was extended for another year. We've got another $2 billion. It's not there to just plug holes in the budget, but believe me, when it's COVID related spending, it's going to help us make ends meet. In addition, there is every reason to expect that the new Congress and the new presidential administration will be following up with additional funds going to states, local governments, or at least to the economies of states that will generate the kind of revenue that we need at the state and local level. So while we're not completely out of the woods, and I would much, much prefer to enter a legislative session with a healthy surplus rather than a modest deficit, it's a bit of a relief because there's been a lot of very rational hand wringing about how on earth the legislature is going to keep its promise to funding public education. Remember, that was the big landmark achievement of the last legislative session. We not only restructured school finance in many useful, good ways, we also put more money into schools. And it wasn't just a fixed amount of money, it's an ever increasing amount of money. And so the question was, where is it going to come from? And the answer was, we'll figure that out later. I'm sure Texas will continue to grow and we'll have plenty of money. So when COVID hit and crushed us, it really was quite alarming. Now, I think those those fears can now reasonably be allayed, at least temporarily, unless things get worse. And there's generally reason to think they'll get better. That we're going to be okay. We're going to fund public education. Those transportation projects that take a 5-year time horizon that cannot be interrupted every 2 years, or you can never plan them, or companies go out of business, we can continue our infrastructure projects, our water projects, highways. We can find funding for broadband development, our IT infrastructure in this state, which has been so vital in the context of the pandemic. So we're in better shape with the budget, but there will always be pressure to find new sources of revenue and pressure to find ways to spend less on things where we can spend less and still get the same efficient results. In fact, a lot of what I try to do is find ways to do things well that help people that end up costing less money. That, in fact, is not a bad segue into talking about some of the bills. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about political philosophy to town hall, but I would like just to say a real high level way that I like to look at the function of government and what legislators are charged with doing. We're not here to give people stuff. We're not here to give businesses stuff, but we are here to build the environment in which the people who live here, the businesses they work for, are likely to succeed. And notice I didn't say where people have a fair shot. Fair shot really isn't going to help that many people. I, um, I had a fair shot of playing professional basketball, but I didn't make it because I was not very good. See, but we want to build a society where people don't face those kind of odds, where people are likely to make good decisions, to take care of themselves, to be productive, and lead happy lives. If we can do that, we don't have to mess with too much else. We don't have to be in the way, but we've got to put the environment. So one example to make this concrete and not too uh, um, abs- not too conceptual, uh, public education. That's the environment I'm talking about. If we're going to charge people with being the agents of their own destiny, and I'd like to, you got to give them an education. Nobody disagrees on partisan or any other lines that education is important. Public education is important. That's the environment we've got to create. Another place that I think environment is critical is in health. If you don't have your health, it's really hard to be individually independent. That's why I've been looking very hard at the problem of Texas's uninsured rate. Most of you know, I expect that we've had the highest uninsured rate in the nation for a long time. We've had the most uninsured people for a long time. It's a huge problem. It's a social problem because it's sad and it destroys lives and it prevents people from leading the lives that they otherwise could. And it's an economic problem because that's lost work hours. That's lost productivity. That's that's businesses having to stop and start and hire and fire and get new employees. That's rising health insurance costs. That's people going to the emergency room for their care instead of to primary care before their condition became acute and expensive. And so we've got to fix that. And the option has been available to us for a while. People would say, and I would say, Medicaid expansion, but those words haven't done so well in Texas. And let's be respectful of people who are worried about Medicaid expansion, who want to do this a way that works just for Texas, specifically for Texas. What else can we do? Well, the answer is there ain't nothing else that's as good as an Affordable Care Act drawdown of federal Medicaid dollars. But maybe we don't do it the traditional Medicaid expansion way. Maybe we do it through an 1115 waiver or something that gives us permission. The federal government gives us permission. I'll tell you what, we'll give you those Medicaid dollars, do these basic things, but do the rest of it the Texas way. And we can figure out a way that works for us. That's a bill that I've proposed. It's called the Live Well Texas Plan. It draws down those same Medicaid expansion dollars at that same 90 to 10 rate that covers people ages 19 to 64 who right now cannot be covered, that up to 138% of the federal poverty level. If you're looking for a narrow population, folks, this is already pretty narrow. They're living in poverty. We can draw down that money and take care of 1 million people. You want to summarize this whole Live Well Texas plan effects? We pick up 1 million people, and here's the kicker: it makes money for the state. You want to learn more about it, please go to my website, senatornathanjohnson.com. I've got a lot of discussions about coverage expansion, and we can just refer to it as coverage expansion. But we absolutely have to get everybody on board with this, not just Democrats, Republicans. And there are a lot of Republicans who understand it. Everyone understands the social importance of healthcare, but the fiscal importance of having that 90-10 drawdown, it could mean $2.5 billion revenue dollars to Texas. Yes, we're paying for more people, but we save money and generate money when that money comes in. Expert economists have looked at it. So it's really a fantastic opportunity for Texas that we've been working really hard to move forward. One thing on that is not too in the weeds. For those of you who are following healthcare and you're wondering, is the Medicaid, is the coverage expansion argument now moot? Again, forgive me just a little digression into the weeds. The governor and the Health and Human Services Agency recently went to Washington and negotiated a renewal of a deal that we've had for the last 8 years that starts to wind down in this ninth and 10th year. They gave us money that's helped us stay afloat in terms of providing care to uninsured people. And it's a good thing. I am really glad that the Center for Medicaid and Medicaid Services granted an extension of the old deal because we're still going to need that money. They're giving us money for what's called uncompensated care. We're talking about uninsured people getting their care at the emergency room. It's very, very, very expensive to this state. I'm glad we have that backstop. But there's something that it doesn't do. That extension is essentially getting back almost what we had. And what we had is 5 million uninsured people. The extension deal doesn't insure anyone. It doesn't mean it's a bad deal. It means it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't cover people and it doesn't bring in money at 90-10, so it doesn't generate money for our state economy. So the discussion's far from over. We're going to move forward with these two pieces in complement. Meanwhile, there's other health bills because this stuff's all got to work together. We have private insurers in this state that contract with the state to take care of the indigent. We want them to take care of things called social determinants of health. What does that mean? It means things in your life that are going to affect your health that aren't necessarily health care. So we have a bill that is going to encourage the state to contract with the private insurers who do a good job with social determinants of health. We also want to address the super high, unsustainably high private sector insurance rates. So I have a bill called a 1332 waiver, high risk reinsurance pool that will draw in more insurers, that brings in competition, that lowers the cost of health insurance for everyday people in the private sector, including businesses. So we want to do a lot of things. And then lastly, on the subject of health, we don't want kids to vape. Okay. We don't, in particular, we do not want businesses to sell e-cigarettes to minors. Right now, that's a problem. It's very difficult to enforce. My staff has worked very hard to devise an ingenious scheme to regulate the sales of vaping products to minors and enforce it. We almost passed that bill last session. It got killed on a bizarre point of order. It's not going to happen. We're talking with the House. It's not going to happen again, and we're going to pass that bill this time. And speaking of smoking stuff, I want to move to criminal justice reform. Marijuana. Personally, I do not think that Texas will take the step of legalizing marijuana right now. We'll see what happens. I wanted to file a bill that addresses the possibility that Texas doesn't legalize marijuana. What are we going to do about the awful effects on law enforcement, on racial equity, on economics of a penal system that imposes unduly harsh, absurd, and damaging criminal penalties on people for small personal consumption amounts of marijuana? So we have what we call B2C. It takes a personal use marijuana quantity down from a Class B misdemeanor to a Class C misdemeanor. That means it moves it down to basically the level of a traffic ticket. That means a lot of people are not going to be going to jail for having a little bag of marijuana in their car. It means they're not going to lose their job. It means they're going to be there to pick up their kids from school. It means they're going to be able to pay taxes. It means they're going to be productive, participating citizens, and they're not going to be draining law enforcement resources away from much more serious property crimes and violent crimes. That's the kind of thing we want to happen. Also, we have a really bizarre disparity in how we treat marijuana on the one hand and marijuana concentrates on the other hand. Kind of obscure out there. It's not something that really is in the lives of a lot of people, but it's in the lives of some people. And when a kid can be charged with a first-degree felony for baking a batch of marijuana concentrate, hash oil brownies, we've got a problem. So we're going to fix inconsistencies and dumb misaligned penalties in the law to make sure that our criminal justice system works so that police can use their resources to do the things that they need to do. More efficient use of our money, better treatment of our people. On the social front, you can look at almost every social issue from an economic angle. It's important to look at it from the social angle. I certainly do. Let's talk, for example, about LGBT laws, right? There is the social, there's the moral component, which I'm fully behind, and there's an economic component, particularly in a state that wants to grow, particularly in a state that wants to draw talent. If we have a reputation for being bigots, for being homophobes, for being unwelcoming, for being intolerant, it's really tough to attract talent. Meanwhile, it's just not the kind of place I want to live. I don't want to live in a place that treats people differently. It's not just unconstitutional, it's wrong. So we've got some very simple bills. We're trying to clean up some bad areas of the law where people are treated differently where they shouldn't be. For example, and this one's totally obscure, but it's so obscure it's kind of fun. There's a law in Texas that says if you have an insurance policy for that covers in vitro fertilization, you can only do it if one of the married people is the sperm donor to this in vitro fertilization. Well, what if it's a married pair of women? It doesn't work. Whatever you think about it, that's not fair. We're treating people differently under the law, and I don't want to do that. Lastly, on the social and constituent interest topic, I guess I would say, is what we're calling the senior safety bill. Tragic, tragic serial murder series of events here in North Texas, where a person was posing as staff or cleaning crew at senior living centers, killing people who lived there, taking their jewelry, and selling it. My staff has spent many, many hours meeting with the children, adult children, of seniors who've been murdered. There've been 20 of them so far that we know about, to find a way to make senior living centers safer. Now, this is where the skill in legislation comes in. You can't just put in a law and pass it because there's going to be resistance. I can't just come in there and regulate and mandate that this center do this and this center do that, and it's going to raise costs. But how can we work this through? And Jack's been working on this, and we thought up, and largely he thought up a way to let's figure out how we can create a market incentive to make senior living centers safer. What about a certification? What if a senior living center could say, we're certified by the state as having safe practices so that when your mom or your dad or your mom and dad come to live here, they're going to be safe. They then have an advantage over somebody who's not certified. So we create a system in which this certification could be applied for. Meanwhile, we strengthen some criminal laws, we strengthen some law enforcement laws so that people can't fence the gold, melt it down, take it, run away without getting detected. So we're trying to address that issue in ways that work in tandem with market forces and will meet the least amount of resistance possible. And we're looking to partner with a lot of people in the Senate and the House. And I'm happy to report that we already are partnering with I have a House Republican who's on this issue. I'm a Senate Democrat. I'm on this issue, and we're both going to be picking up people from both parties to move this forward. It is an example where partisanship's out the window. We just got to get this done. Last topic I want to hit, and then we'll move on to some questions on the energy and the environment front. There's a great deal to do, but I do want to start with a note of optimism. I do think that in the energy production space, there are market forces as well as policies, but there are market forces that are pushing us in some good directions. So there's reasons to think that maybe the wind is at our back. Perhaps that's a pun. But there's still a lot we need to do. We've had a problem with above ground storage tanks catching on fire, spewing toxic chemicals into the air, blowing up, things like that. And it's not necessarily that anybody was negligent in constructing these things. It's that the environment has gotten tougher. We're having more hurricanes. We're having more cataclysmic events. They're going to have to be designed stronger. There's costs involved when you go in and start imposing regulations. Is industry going to be able to accommodate this? Is it realistic? Well, it's important. So we've been talking, I've been talking with people in industry, with people in safety, with environmental groups, with the Sierra Club, to try to figure out a way that we can regulate above ground storage tanks because they're not presently in a way that will meet the least industry opposition. And it's got to be achievable, right? But it can't go neglected. So we're trying to look at topics across the spectrum of the political things that are important in our state. I've got, like I said, over 100 bills between what we've filed and in the hopper. We've touched on just a few of them. Oh, we haven't talked about education. Sorry. One more. No, I lied. Two more. Um, Social and emotional learning. We had the big education bill last session. What's left to do? What's left to do is make sure that we fund it and make sure that it works and improve it. But other things, we can continue to get better results from our education system. And there's something called social and emotional learning, um, which has to do with the ways kids develop as human beings. Why would we impose that on the school? Shouldn't that be done at home? Well, never mind that that's kind of unrealistic some of the time. I think that if we have a setting where kids are spending much of their lives and much of their time and they're with other kids and they're with teachers and there is a curriculum into which social and emotional learning can be woven, why wouldn't we do it? Why, in fact, wouldn't we do it when the academic studies that have looked at it have seen that test scores rise for the kids who have social and emotional learning woven into their curriculum versus a control group that did not? So we've got some empirical evidence that says this isn't just fluffy social do-gooder stuff. It is do-gooder stuff. It is good to develop as a human being and develop character and learn how to handle depression and distress and anxiety, but it also raises test scores. It also raises prospects to get a job, to go to college, all these things. Been working with Big Thought on this one, and thank you to Big Thought for working with us on this. Uh, just another example of how constituencies can be partners in the legislative process. And it is COVID, and in COVID time, we lose light bulbs now and then. Um, the last bill I want to talk about is the egg bill, because I put it in my email. We would talk about everything from eggs to democracy. And we were looking at a bill that would help people take their backyard eggs to the farmer's market. Hey, everything matters, folks. Everything matters, especially if you're a backyard egg farmer. Um, but we might not need it because the whole issue might be resolved by regulatory authority. And I bring that up for two reasons. First, because I mentioned eggs in my email inviting you to this town hall, but secondly, because it's a fascinating interplay between what the legislature does and what the agency or what the executive branch of the government, i.e., the agencies, do. And it's also something that I and my staff are constantly tasked with. What can the agency do? What can the legislature do? What does the agency need from the legislature in order to do what it needs to do? That social determinants bill I talked about, the legislature needs to tell the agency to award contracts to insurance companies that do a good job of accommodating social determinants of health. So it's something I just like to explain to people, how the legislative process works, how the government works, and keep in mind that if you want to be involved in some of this stuff, you may be involved at the agency level. But we'd be happy to talk with you about that or anything else. Hopefully, I've given you some things to think about, some reasons to be optimistic, maybe some questions. And speaking of questions, let's move to questions right now. Looks like we have a question. Would I be willing to promote the national popular vote compact in the Texas legislature? Well, I filed it. So yes, I filed the National Popular Vote bill. For those who don't know what that is, it's SB 130. Um, Many of us are frustrated that at least in a presidential election, we've got 4, 5, 6, 7 states that receive all the campaigning, and Texans and Californians and New Yorkers feel like, well, everybody knows which way our state's going to go, so our vote doesn't really count because the Electoral College is basically going to moot my vote. Well, the National Popular Vote is not going to destroy the Electoral College, but it says that we pledge to give all of our electoral votes to the presidential candidate who wins the national popular vote. If enough states do that, if enough states do that to where they add up to 270 electoral votes, we will effectively have created a system wherein the presidential candidate who receives the most votes, which generally is a good way of deciding elections in a democracy, actually wins the presidential election. Um, so, yes, short answer to actually long answer to short question. Yes, I would support the National Popular Vote movement. I have filed the bill SB 130. Next, what's the scope of the Jurisprudence Committee? I don't know. I don't know. I've only been on it for a week and we've never met, and it didn't exist last session. It existed in the I don't quite know the scope of the Jurisprudence Committee. We handle things that are jurisprudential, and I'll get back to you with more on that. I think that probably one of the biggest issues, a lot of the things that have to do with the court systems, I guess to give you a less flippant answer, you deal with the court systems. Um, and a lot of that legislation has previously moved through the State Affairs Committee. It'll now be coming through the Jurisprudence Committee. I suspect we're going to be spending a lot of our time looking at the courts of appeals and how they're spaced throughout the state and the caseloads that go through each of them and the jurisdictions of each of them. And it could be contentious, or we wouldn't have a committee. So I expect that the Jurisprudence Committee will be handling some very contentious stuff. I have yet to see what it is. They put me on there because I'm a lawyer. Next, a psychiatrist from UT Southwestern asks, have an interest in support for telemedicine, telepsychiatry, telephone reimbursement, including after the pandemic is over? What an excellent question. And the question itself is really a point. Um, Telemedicine has been an absolute lifesaver in a literal sense and a figurative sense. We've gone from it being kind of a very modest, minor part of our healthcare system to being a ubiquitous major part of our healthcare system. In order to get it there during the pandemic, the governor has emergency powers under the Chapter 14 of the Texas Government Code, whereby he can suspend a lot of the rules that I guess one way to put it would you could say they impeded use of telemedicine. Less pejoratively, I think people just hadn't gotten there yet and figured out what the regulatory framework should be. So we've gone through and hacked away a lot of the regulation that was in place that really wasn't up to date on this new development in healthcare and technology. And the question gets to how much of that is going to be permanent. And it's something that we did look at over the interim. I think a great deal of the things that were cleared out will be permanent. Others are going to be rewritten in a way that makes sense in light of changing healthcare markets, changing healthcare technology, changing regulatory environments, in consultation with healthcare providers, patient advocates, payers. All of that is going to be a very active part of the conversation in this session. But I think you can count on an expansion of telepsychiatry, telemedicine, and a close look at reimbursement systems. Next. Ooh, wow. Okay. The governor seems intent on taking away local control and punishing municipalities that reallocate law enforcement funding. Your thoughts on the success of passage of these punitive measures? Okay. Yeah, there has been an unfortunate just bent in the legislature for the past few sessions against cities. I do think there's partisan origins to it. I do think that it's counterproductive. Just start by saying there are some laws that ought to be federal. There's some laws that ought to be state, and there's some laws that ought to be local. Some matters that ought to be governed at the local level. And you're never going to be able to define those three zones and have it be static. It's going to change every session, and that's okay. There's some give and take, and the cities are going to overreach, and the state's going to overreach. That's fine. But to have a bent that we're going after cities, that we're going to punish cities, that we're going to make cities uh, the object of ridicule and of our efforts to take power away. I mean, I'm not against big centralized power. So the idea of taking power from the cities and bringing it to the state government of the state of Texas, running the police department for a city, no, I think these are pure political stunts, which politicians often do. And behind the scenes, sometimes they admit, "Yeah, you wouldn't believe what I said to get elected." I don't talk that way. I don't act that way. But it's the reality of politics. People say stuff that's tweetable, that gets clicks on this or that form of social media that newspapers like to write about. I don't think it's serious. I hope I'm correct and not incorrect on that. As far as messing with police forces who defund the police, no one's defunded the police. Austin took some aggressive measures. No other city has come anywhere near close. The city of Dallas got beat up because it very minor, by a very minor amount, reduced its police overtime budget when it increased its overall police budget, and the city of Dallas still got beat up for it. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. I will vote against it. I'll do what I can to kill it. And I think that we're going to do a lot better when the cities, the counties, and the state government are cooperating, figure out what's your capacity to handle things. How can I help you rather than interfere with you doing the things that you need to do? Another question. Somebody's thanking me for SB 151, which is relating to the criminal penalties for possession or delivery of marijuana and marijuana concentrate. We talked about that earlier. Do you think it will even get a committee hearing? Yeah, I do. I do think it's going to get a committee hearing. I don't know that it will. I can't promise that it will, but man, I hope so because we've spent a lot of time on it. And it's really addresses a lot of things that people don't think about, like the hemp industry and how law enforcement can differentiate from this and from that, a consistency with synthetic substances. I mean, it's a big, difficult piece of legislation that addresses a lot of problems at once. The reason I think it will get a hearing is this is one of the areas of criminal justice where I'm going to use political terms that I hate right now, but the right and the left, the ultra liberal, the ultra conservative, the slightly conservative, across the spectrum, people are finding something about marijuana laws to dislike and to want to change. Whether it's ruining lives, whether it's depressing the economic prospects of a region as a result of ruined lives, or the money that we're spending to keep people in prison, or the law enforcement resources that we're wasting, there is a consensus right now, a pretty strong core of people from the right and the left who agree that this is something we ought to change. Um, and it's not to say that anybody condones or doesn't condone marijuana use, but looking at it objectively, is society better off with these policies as opposed to a different policy? I think we've got a pretty loud chorus of people saying, no, it's not. And particularly because what we're talking about is a B2C and changing marijuana concentrates, not legalization, which is a much more controversial topic. Um, we've seen lots of reasons to think that this is something that has enough interest that it gets a hearing. I can't promise it. There's a lot of political forces at work the whole time. But we're going to do everything we can to get it a hearing and pass it. Texas state plumbing law and the Plumbing Regulatory Board expire this year. Would the Business and Commerce Committee look at any proposed bills to rectify this? It's most likely that's where it's going to go. Anything that's left hanging out there that is unresolved is likely to go to that place. And that's where I'll have to learn a lot more about it. I'm not today the best person to answer questions about that, but um, we do deal with agencies, and the plumbing laws are one of the things that didn't quite get fixed last session. In addition to new bills, the next question reads, does the legislature ever go back to review old laws on the books to assess if they are still effective, necessary, etc.? Excellent question. The answer is yes, in a couple of different ways. We have a sunset review process that is charged specifically every interim with going back and looking at a certain set of laws and deciding, are these still good? The reason that's so important, and the reason that that is an excellent question, is that the environment that we govern changes over time. Markets change, attitudes change, populations change, needs change, pandemics come. Um, let's take natural resources for example. One of the bills that, or one of the laws that I'd certainly like to strip off the books is a tax break that was enacted for natural gas producers back in 1997. Now, I'm not against natural gas producers. I think it's done a lot to develop cleaner sources of energy, bridge fuel, all sorts of stuff. We can talk about the environment and relationships there, but let's just look at this one little law. If you're talking about getting rid of things that are no longer useful, it was incentivizing production for places where it was difficult to produce natural gas before fracking became so effective. Now, once fracking comes in there, we're in a wash and a glut of natural gas. We've still got a tax break to incentivize production when production is just churning and churning and churning. That is a market distorting tax break. And I don't like market distortion, certainly unless we have a really good reason for it. So let's take a look at that 1997 law. It's difficult, though. You raise a question that raises this important political thing called inertia. Once something's on the books, it's hard to get it off there. Once resistance to something starts, it's hard to shift the direction of it. So yes, we do that, and I personally charge myself and my staff with trying to find things that aren't effective anymore in changing them. It's also, when we talk about the budget, it's a good way to save money sometimes, because maybe what we did was efficient under the old circumstances, but under the new circumstances, it's not. Questions. Speaker Phelan recently, oh, this will be my last question because we are getting kind of late at night here. Speaker Phelan recently commented to the Texas Tribune that Medicaid expansion does not have the votes, but that there is a Texas solution to the uninsured problem in Texas. Your thoughts? Wow, what a nice teed up question. I swear I didn't write that myself. Yes, there is a Texas solution. It's called the Live Well Texas Plan. It's SB 117 is what I filed. It is not traditional Medicaid expansion. It is an expansion waiver that encourages people to take agency in their own health care. It's got health savings accounts. It's got cost sharing. It's got social determinants of health. It's got a self-destruct mechanism if the federal government takes the money away. It gives Texas much more discretion in how to administer and spend funds on indigent health care, and generates a ton of money for the state at the same time without raising taxes. We absolutely have a plan, and it's important that Speaker Phelan and Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and all the Republicans in the House and Senate be able to approach an ACA healthcare expansion, drawing down federal Medicaid dollars in a way that's specific to Texas, where they can say this is consistent with our conservative values. And it was successful in Ohio, it was successful in Indiana, it was successful in a half a dozen other Republican-led states. So there is a way to do this, and the fact that Speaker Phelan would say that there is a way that we can do it, to me, is a very auspicious sign. And I will tell you that I've been talking with both Democrat and Republican members of the House and the Senate, very high level of interest. Um, but I want to emphasize on that note, whether we're talking about marijuana concentrates or eggs, um, or vaping products, driver's license suspension, which is another ridiculous criminal law that we're going to get rid of, senior safety or Medicaid expansion, or just an ACA drawdown of dollars at 90/10, whatever we're talking about. If you want to be involved, now's the time to make your voice heard. It's early in session. Let's not let the cement harden. Let's push this agenda forward. If you've got questions about things, feel free to call my office. I've got great staff. They'll talk to you. I'll talk to you. Feel free to call other legislators. I encourage you, keep these discussions going, because otherwise these things don't happen. We will need your help on all of this. I want to once again thank my staff. I can't tell you how smart and hardworking they are. We've got a reputation in the legislature for they've got a reputation in the legislature for being uh, good to work with, accessible, and really, really good. And I also want to thank my family, because this job occupies not just a lot of time, it occupies my head sometimes. And having the support of your family there um, gives you a much firmer base when you get up every day and know you got to do this work. You want to feel like your family is there behind you, and my family has always been there behind me. My kids, my wife, my parents are on the phone, my brother and sister. And then lastly, I want to thank all of you. I recognize a number of names here. I'm very pleased that so many of you could join us tonight. I wish we were in person. It's a lot more fun. Let's do it in person next year. Um, and in the meantime, please stay engaged, follow what's going on, SenatorNathanJohnson.com, and follow the whole legislature. Be happy to talk to you if you have things you want to talk about during this session. And that's all. I'm going to let you get back to your lives tonight. Thank you very much for being here with me this evening.